Good afternoon / evening, everybody. Welcome to AP World History Modern. My name is Mason Logereau, coming to you from Pflugerville, Texas, in the Austin area. You can tell I'm in the Austin area because today I'm wearing a shirt with an armadillo playing a guitar, because that's what we do in Austin. I hope everybody's having a good day. So far today, I did venture out into the world to go grocery shopping. And the most important thing I got was Easter candy from the Easter Bunny for my kids. And I may have dipped into the candy stash a little earlier today because the Easter Bunny got a little hungry and wanted an afternoon snack. But I promise you that while the Easter Bunny, me, was at the store today, I was hopping along, but still practicing safe social distancing. All right, so what are we doing today? Actually, today's kind of an important day or milestone here. Today is our first day of review of topics that you could possibly see on next month's AP test. If you remember, for the last week or two, we've been covering events and processes in the 20th century. That is not going to be on the AP test, but is still important. But today we're going to kind of go way back to the beginning, to the year 1200. And specifically, we're going to look at the regions of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. Now, this Unit 1 here, it's kind of a new thing for AP World History. And we're going to cover it over today, tomorrow, and Friday. Smith tomorrow will be around, and I'll be around on Friday. But the idea behind it was, because this course now starts in 1200, this unit's called the Global Tapestry. It's supposed to be sort of a tour of the world, so you can see what things are looking like in 1200, and then you kind of move forward with world history. Now, some teachers did this a little different than others, so I'm not exactly sure how it went at your school. Some teachers went through each of these topics, kind of like we're going to do today. Some teachers sort of skipped this unit, but then as they started talking about different regions of the world, they went back and reviewed it, so kind of covered it in pieces. For me, I did a lesson with my students for the first 2 or 3 weeks of kind of events before 1200 that led into 1200. So just kind of understand, as we're doing this today, tomorrow, and Friday, some of this may seem a little new to you, but you did cover it at some point in your class. All right, so we're going to look specifically at those regions today. We're also going to talk about how to support an argument with historical evidence. And the big thing I'm going to harp on today is, when you have your evidence, you make sure that A, of course, it supports your argument, but also B, that it's specific evidence. I'm going to keep using that word specific today because I really want you to focus on that. All right, as far as what you should already know, you should be somewhat familiar with the major religious and cultural traditions in this area: Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, etc. And speaking of, I'm going to talk a little bit about those today. Also understand that I am going to be mentioning events that happened before 1200. So just keep in mind, no, you're not going to have a specific DBQ about anything before 1200. But you can still use those events and processes as part of your contextualization. I talked about contextualization on Monday. If you didn't get to watch that, please go watch it. But remember, if there's something that happened before 1200 that directly impacts something that you're going to write about in your DBQ, then by all means, please talk about it. All right, so for our warm up, we need to look back at what Smith had y'all do for homework last night. Last night, he asked y'all to develop a thesis statement. He gave you 3 documents from this DBQ about gender roles and politics in the 20th century in Latin America. And notice he brought up a really good point. That word affected. That's the big thing that you need to consider when you're coming up with your thesis statement. How did politics affect gender roles? So he gave you 3 documents. Let's run through these really quick. This first one is from a Cuban senator who is arguing that women should be given equal legal rights, because if they're not, then their demands are going to lead to a revolution. So it's not that he's necessarily pro women's equality, but he's willing to deal with it so that there's not a revolution. But again, notice here we have politics. affecting gender roles for women. And the second one, we have a woman who is trying to organize in support of a jailed communist politician. By the way, you all read the source line, right? You need to read the source line in every single DBQ. Please read the source line. But notice here, we have women that are involved, as Smith put it, in grassroots political movements. So women are taking leadership roles. So again, politics affecting gender roles. And then in document 3, we have the Sandinista Party in Nicaragua. It was a socialist organization trying to start a socialist revolution in Nicaragua. And here, notice they're arguing for women's equality and political equality and also economic and cultural equality. So again, the political part is involvement in socialist movements. It affects gender roles by giving women equal rights. So once you look at all 3 of those documents, you can put them together into a thesis statement. And here's one example of Smith's thesis statement that he wrote. Again, yours might look similar. It might look different. It's fine if it's different, but talk to your teacher about it if you want to get some feedback on it. But again, he's arguing that these revolutions to protect lower classes often led to greater participation in politics for women. And those 3 documents do seem to back that up. All right, so let's do a quick brainstorming warm up for our topic today. I told you we're going to talk about East Asia, we're going to talk about Southeast Asia, and we're going to talk about South Asia, and kind of this time period from around 1200-ish to 1450-ish. Okay, imagine next month you start the AP test and the DBQ involves one of these regions and this time period. When you read the prompt and you look, you're going to see a region, you're going to see a time period. You need to automatically start thinking of events, processes, people, places, empires, things that might possibly come up in the documents, or ideas that you could put into your contextualization, or as those outside evidence points to prove your claim. So take about 1 minute, and I'd like you just to jot down, or at least think in your head, what are all the things that you think of from this time period in these 3 regions? So take 1 minute, go. All right, you got about 30 seconds. Again, just jot down as much as you can remember. This is a good exercise for you to do before when you get the DBQ prompt, but it's also good just to kind of get your brain moving for today as we go through these regions and this time period. Take about 10 more seconds. 5, 3, 2, 1. And let's look at our list. Again, you might have things that are completely different than mine. Hopefully you have at least some of these. You hopefully remembered some of the Chinese dynasties from this time period. We are going to talk about the Song dynasty today. Unfortunately, we're not going to talk about the Yuan or the Ming today. But I promise you, we're definitely going to talk about the Yuan because we have to talk about the Mongols, but we have to wait till next week on that. Hopefully, you put down some of the major religions and religious traditions in these areas. In East Asia, Confucianism, and eventually Buddhism. In South Asia, Hinduism, Buddhism, and then Islam spreads there. Southeast Asia, Buddhism and Islam are obviously very big. And we're going to talk about each of those today as well. All right, so let's get into the notes on what you need to know from this time period in these regions. But before we can get into the history part of it, let's think about geography. This is a map that comes straight from the CED, the course and exam description. If you've never seen it before, talk to your teacher about it, make sure you have a copy of it, because you need to know these regions of the world, because there's a good chance that you're going to see one of these regions listed as part of the prompt or somewhere in the DBQ for an AP test. So for example, if we're talking about South Asia right here, when you think South Asia, you probably automatically think India. And that's good. You definitely should. Because South Asia, India, for the most part, are kind of the same thing. But there are some differences, and you need to be aware of them. First off, South Asia covers not just what is today India, but also Pakistan and Bangladesh. So let's remember that. Secondly, if we think about the modern country of India, it really has not been a unified country for that long. Through most of history in this region, there's been several empires, several kingdoms, very few that covered that entire region. So you need to be very careful in your writing to not say India if you're referring to something in this time period, because at this point in history, there really is no India. If you're talking about the modern state, if you're talking about, Gandhi or something like that, then by all means, talk about India. But in this time period, there are several different kingdoms and empires, and we'll look at a couple of them today. Same thing here in East Asia. When you think East Asia, you probably think China. And yes, China has definitely been the top dog in that region through most of history. But as I'm going to point out today, also remember, when you talk about Korea, when you think about Japan as well, they are both big parts of East Asia too. So just make sure that you know these regions. If you see South Asia, you should think India, but also know the difference. If you see East Asia, you should automatically think China. But again, make sure you know the difference. All right, so I'm going to start with South and Southeast Asia. We're going to talk about culture. We'll talk a little about governance as well. Then we're going to stop and do a little bit of work on evidence and thesis statements, and then we'll switch over and talk about East Asia. Okay, when you're thinking about South Asia and you're thinking about religion and culture, the number one thing that should come to your mind immediately is, of course, Hinduism. Hinduism has been the predominant religion in South Asia going back to ancient times up until modern times. Okay. When you think of Hinduism also, you should consider the effects that it has on the caste system of India, which again is something that we see in South Asian society almost throughout history. Remember that caste system. It's a very rigid social structure. Meaning, when I say very rigid, meaning that the caste you're born into is probably the caste you're going to die in. There's really very little chance of moving up the social ladder or moving down the social ladder. But when you take a look at world history as a whole, and we can do that now because we've studied it all year, that isn't that unusual. Many regions across many time periods have had rigid social structures. If you're born a peasant farmer through most of history in most regions of the world, then you're probably going to die a peasant farmer. If your dad is one of the government elites, then you're probably going to end up being one of the government elites. Here in the United States in the 20th and 21st century, we have this idea of like anybody enough or anybody can become president. And yeah, that's great and that's wonderful. But that's a very modern idea. You really don't see that idea through most of world history. Now, what does make the caste system unique, though, is one, extremely rigid. There were laws about people in castes not able to socialize with people in other castes. And, of course, the influence of Hindu beliefs on the caste system, mainly the beliefs of karma and reincarnation. To where, if you take those traditional ideas of karma and reincarnation, then the caste system does sort of begin to make sense. People in the upper castes have lived very good lives over several lifetimes. They kind of deserve to be there. People in lower castes, well, according to karma and reincarnation, they've been bad over several lifetimes, so they deserve to be there. So you see religion influencing the social structure. All right. The other major religion you should think of in South Asia is, of course, Buddhism. Buddhism is most definitely an offshoot of Hinduism. Remember, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha himself, was a prince in South Asia. But what's interesting is that you really never see Buddhism taking off as a major religion in South Asia, but it obviously becomes popular in other regions of the world, mainly Southeast Asia and East Asia in China, as we'll look at here in a second. The third major religion you need to consider in South Asia is, of course, Islam. Smith is going to go more into Islam tomorrow, so I don't want to go too far into it. But of course, you know that the religion of Islam begins in the 600s. And by around the year 1000 or so, it comes to South Asia through invasion by Turkic groups. But even though we see a string of Muslim kingdoms and empires in South Asia up until 17, 1800s, you don't see that many people in South Asia converting to Islam. We're going to see mass conversions of Islam in other parts of the world, in the Middle East, in North Africa, and Southeastern Europe. But you really don't see it too much in South Asia, even though in some of these kingdoms, the main political leaders are Muslim. But it's just that one, really Hinduism had such a control. I mean, it had been a religion that had been there in South Asia since ancient times. The one group that you do see converting to Islam, though, a lot in South Asia is people in the lower castes. And that does kind of make sense when you think about it, right? If you've been taught that your religion of Hinduism is what's keeping you in this lower caste and subjecting you and leaving you there at the bottom of society, and here comes a new religion of Islam, which, by the way, preaches the idea of equality of all believers, well, that sounds pretty attractive. So you do see some conversions among the people of lower castes, but really not any kind of mass conversion in South Asia. The majority of people in that region still remain Hindu. But you are going to see Islam in Southeast Asia, mainly because of Muslim merchants along the Indian Ocean. And again, Smith's going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow. And then next week, we're going to look at trade routes and the spread of religion. Okay, as far as governance goes, as far as major kingdoms and empires, I told you already, India, as we know it today, the modern state of India, is just really not been around for that long. Through most of history, we don't see a unified Indian subcontinent. But there have been a string of Hindu and Muslim kingdoms that you should kind of be aware of. For one, the major one in this time period is the Delhi Sultanate. It is a Muslim empire in the northern part of South Asia. And keep in mind that distinction is important. You oftentimes see Muslim kingdoms in the northern part of South Asia, but in the southern part of South Asia, it's usually more Hindu kingdoms and empires. So please, please, please keep that in mind, because that's actually a trend we're going to see throughout history in South Asia. And even today, if you look at the modern states of India and Pakistan, Pakistan being in the northern part of South Asia and being predominantly Muslim. Now, of course, that happens because of the partition of India that we talked about last week. So there's a lot of other factors that go into that, of course. But like I said, typically speaking, Muslims are still the minority religion in South Asia. But the majority of Muslims you do see in the Northern Empire. But that doesn't mean that there's not Muslims in the southern part of South Asia, because there certainly are. Again, you see Muslim merchants and Muslim enclaves throughout the Indian Ocean, including in port cities in the southern part of South Asia. And even in some of those Hindu empires, you still see Muslims helping to strengthen the empire. One, through long distance trade and keeping the economy going through merchants. Two, you often see Hindu emperors hiring Muslims to be mercenaries in their army, so to project military power. So keep in mind, even though I say like the majority of Muslims in the area or in the northern part of South Asia, there still are Hindus and Muslims throughout the entire area and working together for the most part. All right, let's take a look at this passage. This is from a secondary source. Hold on one second. All right, this is from a secondary source called Southeast Asia and World History. You can probably guess that it's a book about Southeast Asia in world history because you're really smart. You figured that out from the title. But actually, it's a really interesting book about how Southeast Asia was so important, especially for long distance trade in the Indian Ocean. But what I want to think about here is, in this passage, what is the claim, i.e., what is the thesis of the author, and what evidence is he using to make that claim? So hopefully you've been kind of reading it already. I'm just going to go ahead and show you the answers of what I found, and then I'm going to give you another passage for you to work on. So I went ahead and just highlighted the main claim in red, and then I gave you some of the evidence in yellow. Now, a lot of students, when they look at this passage, think that that first sentence is actually the claim, where he's talking about a complex, increasingly integrated maritime trading system throughout the world, the Mediterranean, the Middle East. You can see all the areas. Okay, that is a historical claim, yes, but that's not the main point of this passage. The main point is that last sentence of the first paragraph, that it led to a mercantile variation of Indianized classical culture in Southeast Asia. Really, the stuff at the beginning of that first paragraph is almost context for that claim. And when you read the second paragraph, then it starts to make sense. Because when you look at the evidence that he gives in the second paragraph, talking about a new capital city with a population of 1 million, trade with China, Chinese merchants moving to the area, that's evidence to prove the claim that I put in red. All right. Hopefully that makes sense because you're about to try it on your own. Okay, so what I have for you is another excerpt from this book. What I'd like you to do is take about 5 minutes or so. I want you to read, and then I want you to either kind of think in your head or write down what's the claim that this author's making, and then also what's the evidence that he's using. Now, one thing I want you to consider, y'all know that this year's AP test is going to be online. We obviously know that it's going to be a DBQ, which means you're going to have to be reading primary source documents. I know this is a secondary source, but still, same idea. You're going to have to read something, and you're used to in class annotating it. I know oftentimes teachers will give you paper copies so that you can jot notes, underline things, highlight it, whatever. Okay, I want you to start thinking about what technology you have in your house and how you're going to annotate or read documents. If you have a printer, okay, great. Then you can print the documents if you want, although that's going to take a little time. And remember, you're only going to have 45 minutes to write this DBQ. And if your house is like mine, you go to print something, but then you realize that maybe your kid used the last piece of paper, or that there's a paper jam, or that it's out of ink. So what's your backup plan going to be? Maybe if you're using a laptop or a tablet, you have some sort of annotation software like a paint program that you can sort of write on the documents with. That'd be great if you have it. But I want you to start thinking about that now. That is not something you're going to wait to the last minute on. What technology do you have available to you? How are you going to annotate documents in this format? And I would practice that right now. If you're planning on using a printer for the DBQ in May, print this off now. Let's annotate it. If you're planning on using a different program, let's use it now. If you're just going to jot down notes on a blank sheet of paper, great. Do that now as well. But you need to start practicing the way you're going to take the test in May, because you don't want to have curveballs thrown to you the day of the test. Okay, but for now, I'm going to give you 5 minutes. I want you to find the claim, and I want you to identify at least a couple of pieces of evidence that the author uses to support that claim. But here's the deal. Y'all know over the last couple of weeks, I've given you assignments, and I've said, okay, you have 5 minutes and go. And then I've just stopped. And it's been kind of awkward because I just stare at the camera for 5 minutes. And every once in a while I say, you have 2 minutes left, you have 3 minutes, whatever. Anyway, I'm getting kind of tired of just like awkwardly staring at the camera because it's kind of weird. Like in my class, I'd walk around and see what you're working on, but I obviously cannot do that. So instead, what I'm going to tell you to do right now is when we start and I say go, pause the video, set a timer for 5 minutes, look at the clock, whatever you want to do. But when you've completed this, when you found the claim and the evidence, unpause it. I will be here with the answers through the magic of video. Ooh. Okay, easy enough? So you got 5 minutes, ready, pause. All right, hopefully you are back with me now after pausing and going through this. I have highlighted the claim in red that the arrival of Islam coincided with the rise of the great port of Malacca. So notice here, I did not highlight that first sentence because that really is not the claim. Yes, Islam definitely spread along Indian Ocean maritime trading routes, no doubt about it. But that's not really the point of what the author is trying to get at in this particular passage. He's talking about this new city in Malaya that has become a huge trading, economic, and political center. And look at all the evidence that he gives to support it. He talks about all the different groups that showed up there from different regions of the world. He talks about the fact there's 15,000 merchants working in the area. He talks about how the Chinese were using this as a way station for their major explorations in the 15th century. And then how it was a rival to all the other major trading cities in this area and other parts of the world. Notice a lot of very good specific evidence that shows how important this trading city was. And that's the big thing that I want to harp on today in your writing. When you give evidence, and of course you're going to do that in any type of essay, be as specific as you possibly can. Okay? Now, no one is expecting you on the DBQ to walk in with information like, hey, there were 15,000 merchants in this city. Okay, you don't need to know the exact number. I did not know the exact number of merchants in Malacca in 1400s. There's no way you would know that. So it's not necessarily have to be like specific numbers, but what I always tell my students, proper names, those are always good. Tell me a specific person or event or place. Notice here, he talks about all the different areas that merchants came from, or talks about Chinese grand voyages or other trade cities. That is plenty specific. That's the kind of thing that you want to consider. So remember at the beginning of class, when I said start brainstorming things that you think of in that area, when you're talking about outside evidence on a DBQ, those are the things that you can bring in, as long as, and this is important, as long as they are supporting your claim. Don't just start writing random facts in your DBQ. Make sure that those facts, those outside evidences, go towards the claim that you're making that answers the prompt. But I'm going to keep harping on this. Be as specific as you possibly can. All right, so that's South Asia and Southeast Asia. Let's jump over to East Asia. And we're talking about East Asia governance. Notice I put here, we're not just talking Chinese dynasties. Yes, those are obviously important, but that's not the only thing going on in East Asia. All right. When we start this course in 1200, the Song dynasty in China is going strong. And yes, you definitely need to know. That's one of those major Chinese dynasties that you need to know. When you think of the Song dynasty, think about the continuities that we've seen so far in Chinese history, going back to the Han dynasty in ancient times. And those continuities are the uses of Confucianism in governing. Okay, remember Confucianist philosophy. A big part of it is about roles and relationships that everyone has to play in society, from the emperor down to the poorest farmer. If everybody plays their roles, then there'll be a happy, harmonious society. And remember also those civil service exams. that were an extremely important part of Chinese governance. Again, going from the Han Dynasty up until the 20th century, those civil service exams were still happening in the early 1900s. And those exams, in order to get a good government job, were often about Confucianism and Confucianist principles. So when we talk about Confucianism being a very important part of governance in China, we mean it, okay? And the Song Dynasty is no different. Also remember, we are seeing a huge population increase during this time in the Song Dynasty. And I'll give you the reason why that is here in a second. But with that population increase, that of course means more people to govern. And so the Chinese bureaucracy has to grow with it and also has to become more efficient in order to have that centralized control over the area. Now, think about the centralized control of China versus the more decentralized power that we see in Korea and Japan. We can't really talk about Korea during this time because in the Korean Peninsula, there are at least 3 different kingdoms throughout this time period. There's not really a unified Korea throughout it. And even those kingdoms in Korea are often being influenced and sometimes kind of controlled by China. They're sometimes kind of seen as like puppet regimes. Similar when we're talking about the Cold War and you had the Soviet Union sort of controlling some of those Eastern European countries. You see the same kind of thing at different points in time here with China and Korea. In Japan, remember that Japan is still mainly a feudal system, very similar to feudalism in Europe, which we'll talk about Friday, I think. I can't remember, and I don't have the schedule in front of me. Sorry. But in Japan, you have the daimyo, the sort of regional warlords that are each controlling their own area of the islands, and their private army and the samurai. So there's not the same centralized control like we see in China. All right, as far as economics go, when you think China and economics, you need to be thinking long distance trade. Remember, we're going to talk about trade more next week, but China, of course, plays a huge role in overland trade across Eurasia. Remember the Silk Road? China plays a big part in it. And remember, now that you have a very centralized control, government control in China, that's going to lead to an increase in long distance trade. You remember last week, I talked about that idea of sort of laws of world history, generalizations that you can make about most regions and most time periods. And that's an important one. When you have a strong centralized government, you see more long distance trade and it helps the economy overall. If you have a strong government, people feel safer as they travel, for them personally, for their personal protection, and for their protection of goods. They know that if there's some sort of argument or disagreement in selling or buying goods, that they can go before a court system. So in times when China kind of fell apart, like after the Han Dynasty, you see a decline in trade along the Silk Road. Now the Song Dynasty's brought it back and reunified and everything, and things are going well, we're going to see an increase in trade along the Silk Road. But you also see increased trade from other localized regions like Southeast Asia. A perfect example of that is champa rice from Southeast Asia and kind of what's today Vietnam area. This is an important innovation in China because this type of rice grows about twice as fast as regular rice, which means that if you have a rice paddy, and I put a picture of one down there, and yes, it looks like it's flooded, but it's supposed to be. But if you have a rice paddy, you can now pretty much grow twice as much food in one particular area. Hey, more food being grown leads to a higher population, like we said a second ago. But of course, you've got to take the rice from the rice paddies and you have to get them to the market to people to bring to homes. So that means you've got to transport those goods. I mean, I guess you could use roads, but it's hard to carry that much rice over roads. It'd be nice if you had like a river or a canal, but gee, that would have to be a really, really big canal, like a super big canal, what would we call something like that? Ah, a Grand Canal. Y'all remember the Grand Canal, right? Actually, it's more of a series of canals in China. Because remember, geographically, most Chinese rivers run east-west. Well, that's great if you want to travel east or west, but if you want to go north or south, that's an issue. And so the Grand Canal was built and expanded during this time to help with that north-south travel as well and to connect the major rivers. All right, when it comes to culture and religion in East Asia, obviously Confucianism is still around and is still very important. But we also see the spread of Buddhism into East Asia, mainly through, again, long distance trade from South Asia. Consider merchants in East Asia. Remember that merchants were typically kind of looked down upon. Yes, you can make money buying and selling goods, but they weren't the most popular group of people. A lot of people in China saw merchants as taking something that someone else made, jacking up the price, and then selling it. They felt like merchants weren't really contributing anything to the economy. They're just making money off of the labor of others. And so for a lot of merchants, they were kind of put down. They were not very popular. But now, here's a religion of Buddhism. And specifically, the Buddhism that you need to know about in East Asia, in China, Mahayana Buddhism, which really focuses on the idea of enlightenment for all in this lifetime, that you can reach nirvana in this lifetime. Okay, you're a Chinese merchant. Nobody likes you. But now you hear about this new religion that promises you enlightenment in this lifetime, the end of suffering. Sounds pretty nice. And again, merchants are the ones that are traveling and meeting with Buddhists from South Asia. And as we're going to talk about next week, when we look closer at the Silk Road, remember that oftentimes when merchants are traveling, they're staying in Buddhist monasteries. And if you're staying in a Buddhist monastery, you're probably going to talk to a Buddhist monk. And if you're talking to a Buddhist monk, you're probably going to talk about Buddhism. So we do see Buddhism spreading to East Asia through China, but also through the Korean Peninsula and some even into Japan as well. But we also see the rise of Neo-Confucianism. When you think of Neo-Confucianism, think of it as kind of this traditional Confucianist beliefs, but also with a little bit of blending of Buddhism as well into it. And that's sort of the Confucianism that becomes popular during this time. I love this poem here on the right side. This was written by a Korean scholar. And I think it does kind of show those elements of Neo-Confucianism, which says, though I die and die again, though I die 100 deaths, again, kind of think about that idea of rebirth. But my heart, my red heart, forever loyal to my Lord, will never fade away. Again, thinking about those traditional roles to play in Confucianism as well. And remember, one of those roles is that you're supposed to, give your allegiance to the person who's in charge of you, whether it's your father or your Lord or whatnot. We also, because of those Confucianist ideas, though, also see continued patriarchy through East Asia. I mean, really, when you start looking at Confucianism and those roles and relationships, it's very heavily patriarchal. And again, that's something that we're going to see throughout the world in this time period, unfortunately. But it definitely is an issue in East Asia. And probably the best example of showing that is foot binding. And hopefully your teacher talked to you about foot binding. If they didn't, make sure you look into that, either in your text, probably in your textbook there. But remember that issue of foot binding where little girls were going through a process of having their feet wrapped so tightly when they were young so that the feet would not grow. So that as they got older, their bodies would grow into adult-sized bodies, but their feet would remain the size of child's feet. Because oftentimes in China, men found women with small feet to be attractive. And it's a perfect example of patriarchy that women would have to be forced to go through this process. And again, this is something that starts during the Song Dynasty, but continues on into the early 1900s. So again, make sure you're thinking about kind of continuities that we see, but also changes that are happening in this time period. All right, let's do one more activity today. Again, we're gonna do the thing where I'm gonna give you like 5 minutes, you pause it, and I'll come back to you. Here, we have another secondary source, but I want you to do things a little bit differently this time. I want you to find the claim, just like we already have. But this time, I want you to identify an outside piece of evidence, something that's not mentioned here in the passage, but something that comes from your big brain, or if you need to, during this 5 minutes, if you're struggling, grab your notes, grab your textbook. But let's find an outside piece of evidence that also proves the claim of the author. Okay, so I want you to go ahead and pause right now. Ready? Pause. All right, you're back. So here's our claim right here, that the nomads had an essential but largely unacknowledged role in the spread of culture and technology. If you're going to use that as your claim, and that is a perfectly reasonable historical claim, I gave you a couple of ideas here at the bottom of pieces of evidence that you could do to prove that claim. You could talk about stirrups and horses. You could talk about gunpowder and how that spread as a technology. You talk about the idea of using horses in wartime. Nomadic group that used horses. I wonder what's about to happen to the Song dynasty. But I don't want to spoil it. That's for next week. Or think about, again, the spread of Buddhism and Islam. Those religions especially were being spread over trade routes, but also by nomadic groups. That doesn't mean those nomadic groups were converting wholesale to Buddhism or Islam, but they were spreading the ideas. So again, remember, as part of that DBQ, you're going to have to bring in some outside evidence from your big brain. So make sure you're able to do that. All right, so let's go ahead and summarize what we've talked about today. First off, we identified all the religious, economic, and governmental structures in all three regions. Make sure, though, you can also talk about how they affected each other. How Confucianism affected the government structures in East Asia, for example. Also, make sure that as you're kind of studying this Unit 1 and you're doing sort of your tour of all the different regions that we're going to do today, tomorrow, and Friday, make sure you're doing a lot of comparing and contrasting of them. It's going to make your life so much easier. It's going to make your studying a whole lot more efficient. Notice how earlier I was saying China was much more unified than, say, Korea or Japan. Make sure you can make those connections. Because if you try and study every single region on its own, it's just going to take way too much time and it's going to get you really frustrated. But if you understand those connections, it'll make your life a lot easier. Also, we're talking about evidence and claims. Make sure that any evidence you have in your essay, first off, supports your claim. That's step 1, and that's a big one. But remember, make it as specific as you possibly can. No one's expecting you to come up with exact numbers and figures, but try and mention as many specific events, people, processes as possible. All right, your homework for tonight. It's another short answer question. And again, yes, I know that you're not going to have short answer questions on the AP test this year. Although if you're taking AP US history next year or European history, y'all will. But again, this is thinking about those connections between religion and economics and politics in Asia and East Asia and Southeast Asia. So make sure you get this done tonight. Smith will go over the answers with y'all first thing tomorrow. And thank y'all so much for joining us today. Again, like I said, today is the first day of review material, and we're going to be doing this every Monday through Friday through the rest of the month. Y'all have a good night, and I will see y'all on Friday, but Smith will see you tomorrow.